My name is Varga, and I am 31 years old. 3 years ago, my parents stood in a church and told 200 guests that I was dead to them. Those were the exact words my father used, dead to them. Because I married a man they didn't choose. Because I chose love over their approval, and they decided that was unforgivable. What they didn't know, what none of us knew until 14 months ago, is that my grandmother had been watching every single moment of that war. And 6 weeks before she died, she sat alone in her kitchen with a lawyer named Gerald Foss, and she rewrote everything. Not just her will, the entire architecture of this family's future. The trust she created gave me something my parents never expected me to have. Not money, not property. Control. Complete, legal, irrevocable control over every financial decision that touches the Varga family name. And the first time my father called to ask for my signature on a real estate transfer, I let the phone ring. Then I called Gerald Foss. Before I tell you what happened when my father found out, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 11 years to a kitchen in Millhaven, Ohio, and the last conversation I had with my grandmother before everything changed. I grew up in a house where love came with conditions attached. My father, Roman Varga, ran a mid-sized construction company his own father had built from nothing in the 1970s. By the time I was born, Varga Construction was comfortable. Not wealthy exactly, but the kind of stable that makes people in small towns assume you have more than you do. My mother, Petra, managed the household and managed appearances with equal intensity. She was the kind of woman who ironed tablecloths, who returned phone calls within the hour, who believed deeply that what the neighbors thought of you was a direct reflection of your character. I have one brother, Daniel, 4 years older, built like my father, thinks like my mother. From the time we were small, Daniel was being prepared for something, and I was being prepared to support whatever that something was. He would take over the business. I would marry appropriately and nearby and produce grandchildren on a reasonable schedule. That was the plan. It was never spoken aloud because it didn't need to be. It was just the shape of everything. My grandmother, Marta Varga, was different. She was my father's mother, which surprised people who knew both of them. Roman was sharp-edged and certain. Marta was soft-voiced and observant. She lived 20 minutes from our house in a pale yellow cottage that always smelled like cardamom and old paperbacks. She had a garden that took up most of her backyard, and a kitchen table that had hosted every important conversation I'd ever had. I was 9 the first time I noticed that she watched differently than other adults. Not at me the way grown-ups usually do, past you, through you, at whoever is standing behind you. She watched at me, directly, like she was cataloging something. She never explained it, not then. The summer I turned 20, I started spending Sunday afternoons at her cottage. My parents assumed I was being dutiful. I was, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was that her kitchen was the only room in my life where I could say something honest and not have it used against me later. That summer she told me something I didn't fully understand until years afterward. We were sitting on her back porch watching the garden go gold in the late afternoon light, and she put her tea down and looked at me the way she always did, direct, unhurried, and she said, "Celine, the people who love you without conditions are rare. When you find one, don't trade him for approval. Approval runs out. Love doesn't." I nodded. I thought she was being philosophical. She wasn't. She was telling me something specific about something she already knew was coming. I just didn't have the context yet. That context walked into my life 8 months later, in the form of a man named Oren Castillo. Oren was finishing a graduate degree in structural engineering. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was quiet in the way that reads as serious, until he laughs, and then you understand that the quiet is just patience. He asked me 3 questions that night, and actually listened to all 3 answers. I married him 4 years later. But before I get there, I need to tell you about the years in between, because those years are the whole reason my grandmother did what she did. My parents met Oren for the first time on a Sunday in October. We'd been together 8 months. I was careful about the timing, about the setting, about everything. I made my mother's lamb recipe. I bought good wine. I told Oren what I knew, which was that my parents valued first impressions and stability, and that his degree and his career would matter to them. What I didn't tell him, because I didn't fully know it myself yet, was that my parents valued familiarity most of all. And Oren Castillo, with his quiet confidence and his last name and his way of holding space in a room without filling it with noise, was not familiar. He was not from Millhaven. He was not from their church. He was not what they had imagined when they imagined me. Dinner lasted 2 hours. My father asked Oren 3 questions about his career, and then turned the conversation to Daniel's new project at the company. My mother smiled throughout, in the way she smiles when she has already decided something, and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to say it. After Oren left, my father sat at the kitchen table and said, "He's not what I pictured for you, Celine." I asked what he had pictured. He said, "Someone more settled, someone established." "Oren has a master's degree," I said. "He has a career." "In a city 4 hours away," my father said. "You'd be leaving." I said yes. I probably would be. The table went quiet. My mother refilled her glass without looking at me, and that was the moment I understood that the issue was never Oren's career or his stability, or any of the practical concerns my father was assembling into a case. The issue was that I would leave, and if I left, the plan collapsed. Daniel would run the business, and I would be 4 hours away instead of 20 minutes, and my mother would have one fewer person to call when she needed something managed. The opposition didn't come all at once. It came in layers. First, there were the questions. Gentle, reasonable, designed to introduce doubt. Are you sure you know him well enough? Have you thought about what it means to be that far from family? What happens if it doesn't work out? Then there were the comparisons. Daniel's girlfriend at the time, a local woman named Britt, kept appearing in conversation. Britt's family had been in Millhaven for 3 generations. Her father went to church with my father. She was lovely. My mother mentioned her at least once every time I called home. Then came the pressure, dressed up as concern. Your grandmother isn't getting any younger, Celine. What if something happens? You'll be 4 hours away. Oren's career will always pull you further. These things only go one direction. I didn't fight every battle. I learned early that fighting made them dig in. So I stayed quiet, and I kept showing up, and I kept loving Oren, and I told myself that eventually they would see what I saw. Eventually, the relationship would speak for itself. It didn't work that way. 2 years into our relationship, I drove to my grandmother's cottage on a Sunday in March. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. Not the edited version I gave other people. The real version. The comments. The comparisons. The way my mother had started going quiet on phone calls the moment Oren's name came up. The way my father had stopped asking how I was and started asking when I was coming home, as if the city where I lived wasn't real and Millhaven was still the center of everything. Grandma Marta listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer solutions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, looking out her kitchen window at the garden, which was still bare in March, just dark soil and the stubs of last year's growth. Then she said, "Your father has always confused belonging with ownership. He thinks loving someone means deciding what's best for them." I asked her if she thought they would come around. She picked up her tea. She said, "Some people come around, and some people have to be brought around. The difference is who holds the door." I didn't know what she meant then. I do now. Oren proposed in the spring of the following year. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We called my parents that evening, together, from our apartment. My father said congratulations in the voice he uses when he is actively deciding something. My mother asked where we were planning to have the ceremony. When I said we were thinking of the city, not Millhaven, she said, "Oh, and nothing else." The engagement period was 14 months. 14 months of my parents circling, suggesting, redirecting. Couldn't we consider a venue closer to home? Wouldn't it be simpler if we had the reception at the VFW hall where Daniel and Britt had their engagement party? Didn't I think Oren's family would be more comfortable in a setting that was more... And here my mother paused for the right word. Traditional. Traditional. The word landed differently than she intended, because what she meant was familiar. What she meant was ours. What she meant was a version of my wedding that would look like a Varga event and not like the life I had actually built. I said no to each suggestion, gently and then firmly, and then with the kind of finality that my mother registered as stubbornness, and my grandmother, when I told her, registered as growth. 3 months before the wedding, my father called me directly. No small talk. He said, "Your mother and I have discussed this, and we want you to understand our position." I asked what their position was. He said, "We cannot support this marriage. We want what's best for you, Celine, and we don't believe this is it. We're asking you to take more time, a year, postpone the wedding, and give this more thought." I told him I had given it 4 years of thought. He said, Then give it one more. I said I wouldn't. There was a pause, long enough that I counted my own heartbeats. Then my father said, "If you go through with this, you're making a choice, and choices have consequences." I told him I understood that. He said, "Good, I hope you do." He hung up. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time. Then I called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what my father had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Celine, I want you to listen to me carefully. What Roman is doing is not love. Love doesn't come with a countdown. Go get married. I'll be there." She was. Front row, yellow dress. She cried during the vows, and when Oren leaned down to hug her afterward, she held his face in both hands and said, "You take care of her." He said he would. He meant it. He still means it. My parents did not come. They sent nothing, not a card, not a call, not a message through Daniel, who stood with my father that day, in whatever room they had agreed to stand in together. The church had 200 guests. My parents were not two of them, but my father did make a call. I learned this later from Aunt Vera, my father's younger sister, who had the courage to come to my wedding, even though it cost her 3 months of silence from Roman. My father called the family the week before the ceremony. He told them that Celine had made her choice, and that he and Petra would not be attending, and that they expected the family to understand and respect that decision. Some of them complied. Some didn't. Aunt Vera didn't. My grandmother didn't. And whatever my father expected to happen after the wedding, whatever consequence he believed would follow, what actually happened was nothing. Nothing immediate. Oren and I came back from our honeymoon. We went back to work. We built our life. I called my grandmother every Sunday. I did not call my parents. They did not call me. Months passed. Then a year. Then another. My grandmother's health began to decline slowly, and then faster in the way that health does. First, it was her knees. Then her heart. I drove to Millhaven every 6 weeks, and when I arrived, I went straight to the pale yellow cottage, and not to the house on Fairview, where my parents lived. Sometimes I saw my father's truck parked outside when I drove past. I never stopped. My grandmother never said much about my parents during those visits. She asked about Oren, about my work, about whether the apartment got good light. She made tea, and we sat in the kitchen, and she told me stories about her own life that she had never told me before, about her husband, my grandfather, who died before I was born, about the early years of the business when Roman was just a boy and the company was just a dream and everything was uncertain, about the choices she had made that she would make again and the ones she wouldn't. She said once, "The thing about a family is that it's always somebody's decision. Who's included, who's protected, who holds the door. Most people don't realize that until it's too late." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say. I stored it away without understanding it. 6 weeks before she died, she asked me to come on a Wednesday instead of a Sunday. That was unusual. She had Gerald Foss with her when I arrived. He was her estate attorney, a quiet man in his early 60s with reading glasses on a cord and a briefcase that looked like it had seen 30 years of difficult conversations. He shook my hand and said he was glad to meet me, and then my grandmother sent him to the garden for 20 minutes while she talked to me alone. She told me she had updated her estate documents. She told me she had thought about it for a long time, and that she was at peace with the decision. She told me that she loved my father the way you love someone who has disappointed you so many times that the disappointment becomes part of the love, woven inseparable. And then she said, "But love and trust are not the same thing. Celine, I love Roman. I do not trust him with this." I asked what this was. She said, "Everything I have built, and everything I want to protect." She called Gerald back in. He sat across from us and opened his briefcase and spent 40 minutes explaining the structure of what my grandmother had created. I am not a lawyer. I understood maybe half of it in that room. What I understood completely was this. My grandmother had established an irrevocable family trust. Everything she owned, the cottage, a savings account, a portfolio of modest investments, was held inside it. Total value approximately $890,000. Not a fortune, but not nothing. And the trust contained something more significant than the assets themselves. It contained a governance clause. The Varga family trust had a provision my grandmother called the consent requirement. Any real estate transaction, any significant financial decision involving any asset that had ever been part of the Varga family estate including Varga Construction, which my grandfather had co-founded and which my grandmother still held a minority share in, required the approval of the trust's designated successor trustee. That trustee was me, not Daniel, not my father, not my mother, me, and the trust was irrevocable, which meant that even I could not dissolve it. I could only act within it. The consent requirement was permanent. The only way to remove it was through a legal challenge, which Gerald said would cost more than the assets were worth, and would almost certainly fail given the clear documentation of my grandmother's mental competence at the time of signing. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after Gerald finished. My grandmother watched me with the same look she'd had since I was 9 years old. Direct, patient, like she was cataloging. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She said, "Because you would have worried. And I didn't want you worrying about this when you should have been building your life." I asked her if my father knew. She said, "Gerald will inform him after I'm gone." She squeezed my hand once. I'm going to stop here, because I think you already know what this felt like. If you've ever had someone love you quietly, from a distance, in a way that only revealed itself after they were gone, you know exactly what this felt like. Tell me in the comments. Tell me who your person was. I read every one. My grandmother died on a Tuesday in November. I was with her. The cottage was quiet, and the last of the autumn light was coming through the kitchen window, and I held her hand until it went still. I organized the service with Aunt Vera. My parents attended. It was the first time I had seen them in 3 years. My father stood across the room from me at the reception, and we did not speak. My mother looked at me once, briefly, and then looked away. I did not go to them, and they did not come to me, and the distance between us felt like something physical, an actual mass occupying the space. Gerald Foss called my father 1 week after the funeral. I know this because Gerald called me first, the morning of, to tell me he was making the call. He said he wanted me to be prepared. I thanked him, and I sat in our kitchen with Oren across from me, and I told him everything. He listened the way he always listens, fully, without interrupting. When I finished, he put his hand over mine and said, "However this goes, we handle it together." Gerald called my father at 10 in the morning. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know the result. My father called me at 11:47 that same morning. I know the time because I looked at my phone for a long time before I answered. He said, "Celine." I said, "Dad." A pause. Long. The kind that has too many things in it to be comfortable. He said, "Gerald Foss called me this morning." I said I knew. He said, "Your grandmother gave you controlling interest over this family's assets." I said that was accurate. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not the voice he used when he had decided something. The other voice. The one I heard maybe 3 times in my entire childhood. The one underneath everything else. He said, "How long have you known?" I told him. 6 weeks before she died. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to talk about this, in person." I said I thought that was reasonable. We agreed on the following Saturday. Neutral location. A coffee shop in the town between Millhaven and the city, exactly halfway. I drove alone. Oren offered to come. I told him I needed to do this part by myself. My parents were already there when I arrived. My father was at a corner table, both hands around a coffee cup. My mother was beside him, in her good coat. She sat the way she sits when she is prepared for something to go wrong. Very straight, very still. I ordered tea. I sat across from them. For a moment, nobody spoke. My father said, "I want to understand how this works." I said Gerald had sent him the documentation. He said, "I read it. I want to understand it from you." So I explained it. The trust, the consent requirement, the scope of the governance provision. As I spoke, I watched my father's face do something I had rarely seen it do. Process something he hadn't anticipated. He was a man who planned, who prepared, who controlled the variables. This variable had been outside his reach for 6 weeks before my grandmother died, and he hadn't known it. My mother said, "So, nothing moves without your signature." I said that was correct. Any real estate transaction, any restructuring of the business, any significant financial decision involving Varga family assets required my written consent as trustee. My father set down his coffee cup. He said, "Celine, we made mistakes. I know that. I waited." He said, "What happened with your wedding? The things I said them because I was afraid of losing you, and I handled it exactly wrong." I know that. My mother's hands were folded on the table. She said, quietly, We both do. I looked at them. My father, who had stood in front of 200 people and chosen absence. My mother, who had gone along with it, because she always went along with it. Two people who loved me, I had never doubted that, who had confused that love with ownership so completely that they had punished me for leaving. I said, I believe you mean that. My father looked up. I said, and I'm not here to punish you. I'm not going to obstruct legitimate business decisions or make your lives harder out of anger. That's not what Grandma set this up for, and it's not who I want to be. My mother exhaled, something she had been holding. I said, but I need you to understand something. This arrangement is permanent. It's not a negotiation and it's not a threat. It's a fact. And if we're going to have a relationship, a real one, it has to start from honesty. Not from managing each other, not from performing, from honesty. My father nodded, slow, like a man learning a new language. I drove home and sat in our apartment for a long time before I told Oren how it went. He brought me tea without being asked. He sat beside me and waited. I said, I think it's going to take a long time. He said, most things worth having do. He was right. It has taken a long time. It is still taking time. But let me tell you what happened over the following 14 months, because this is where the story stops being about what was taken from me and starts being about what gets built when the architecture changes. The first consent request came 4 months after that coffee shop meeting. Daniel was restructuring a project contract that involved a property my grandfather had originally owned, which had passed to my grandmother's estate and was now technically within the trust's governance scope. Gerald confirmed it required my signature. Daniel called me directly. That surprised me. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the wedding. He said, Celine, it's Daniel. I said I knew. He said, I have a contract that needs your sign-off. Gerald explained the situation. I asked him to send me the documentation. He did, that same day. Organized, complete, all relevant attachments included. I reviewed it with Gerald. Everything was legitimate. A straightforward restructuring with no red flags. I signed within 48 hours. Daniel called back when he received the confirmation. He said, thank you. I said, of course. A pause. Then he said, I should have come to your wedding. I didn't say anything. He said, I chose Dad. I shouldn't have. I chose wrong. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry, Celine. That was the beginning of Daniel and me. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a phone call with a consent form on one end and an apology on the other. We've had Sunday calls most weeks since then. He and Britt came to visit in the spring. Oren made dinner. We sat on the porch until midnight, talking about everything except the years we lost. And then talking about that, too. My mother called me on a Thursday evening in January, 4 months after the coffee shop meeting. She said she'd been thinking about what I said, about honesty and performance. She said, I have spent my whole life managing how things looked. I learned it from my mother, who learned it from hers. And when you left, what I was most afraid of was what it looked like. Not losing you, how it looked that you were gone. I didn't say anything. I let her keep going. She said, I'm ashamed of that. I have been for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it. I said, you're saying it now. She said, is that enough? I said, it's a start. We talk every week now. Not long calls. Not always comfortable, but honest. She told me last month that she'd started seeing a therapist. She said it the way she says things she is embarrassed about. Quickly, quietly, braced for judgment. I told her that was one of the bravest things I'd heard in a long time, and I meant it. My father was the slowest. That surprised no one who knows him. He is not a man built for apology. He is built for certainty and authority and the forward movement of decisions already made. Walking backward, revisiting, admitting that the certainty was wrong, these things cost him something real, but he did it. 6 months after the coffee shop, he called me on a Sunday morning, early. I was still in bed. He said, I have been talking to your mother and to your brother, and to a counselor, actually. Gerald recommended someone, a man I've been seeing for a few months. I sat up in bed. I said, Dad, I'm glad. He said, he asked me what I was most afraid of when you got engaged. I had a quick answer ready, the usual one, losing you to distance, to someone I didn't know. He said that wasn't it. He said, what were you most afraid of underneath that? I waited. My father said, I was afraid you didn't need me anymore. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly in the street. He said, you were my daughter and you had built a whole life that didn't require my approval or my help or my presence. You didn't need me. And instead of being proud of that, I made it mean I had failed. I made it your fault. I said, Dad. He said, I'm not asking you to forget it. I know that's not how it works. I'm asking you to know that I understand it now. What I did, what it cost you. I said it cost me 3 years. He said, I know. I said, it cost Oren 3 years of being part of a family that should have welcomed him. He said, I know that too. We were quiet for a moment. Then I said, I'd like you to come for dinner, both of you, next month. If you want to. He said yes, without hesitating. That dinner was the strangest and most ordinary evening I have spent in years. My parents sat at our kitchen table. Oren made his family's rice dish, and my mother helped without being asked. And my father washed up afterward because he said he needed something to do with his hands. We talked about Daniel's new project and my mother's job and a book Oren was reading. At one point, my father asked Oren a question about structural engineering. A real question. The kind that requires actual interest to ask. Oren answered at length. My father listened. Afterward, standing in the hallway getting their coats on, my father held out his hand to Oren. Oren shook it. My father said, I'm sorry I wasted this much time. Oren said, we have time now. My father nodded. His jaw was set the way it gets when he is holding something in. He said, yes, we do. They left. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I sat down at the table, and I thought about my grandmother in her pale yellow cottage, telling me that the people who love you without conditions are rare. She was talking about Oren. She was right about that. But she was also, I think, talking about herself. Because what she did wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. The trust, the governance clause, the consent requirement, none of that was punishment. It was architecture. She had built a structure that required my family to come to me, not to plead or perform or apologize with grand gestures, just to come to me, regularly, practically, on ordinary business, to need my presence in their lives in a formal and documented way, until the formal and documented part stopped mattering because the actual relationship had grown back around it. She couldn't make Roman less afraid of losing control. She couldn't make Petra less focused on appearances. She couldn't make Daniel less loyal to whoever was in the room. But she could build a door, and she could put me on the other side of it. And she could make sure that anyone who wanted to move forward had to walk through it. That's what she did. Gerald Foss called me last spring, not about a contract, just to check in, which I've learned is something he does every few months, in the quiet way of a man who has watched a lot of families survive themselves and find satisfaction in the survivors. He said, your grandmother was right about you. You know, I asked what she'd said. He said, she said, you were the one who would hold the door open even for the people who had pushed you out. She said that was why she chose you. Not because you were the toughest or the smartest or the most strategic. I asked him why then. He said, because you were the most likely to use this, to build something, instead of burning everything down. I sat with that for a long time after the call. I'm still sitting with it. I don't have a clean ending for you. The kind where everything is resolved and everyone is healed and the wounds close without scars. That's not what happened. What happened is messier and slower and more ordinary than that. My parents come for dinner 6 or 7 times a year now. My mother has started texting me pictures of her garden, small things, tomatoes she's grown, a bird she spotted. My father asks about my work with genuine curiosity, and then gets competitive about it in the way he gets competitive about everything. Which is actually, strangely, one of the ways I know he respects it. Daniel and I talk every week. Britt and I have become, quietly, friends. Oren fits into all of it with the ease of a man who was never the problem and always knew it. There are still hard moments. There are still conversations that go wrong. There are still Christmases where I can feel the careful architecture of everyone trying and the weight of everything that still hasn't been said. My mother still sometimes manages instead of speaks. My father still sometimes goes quiet when he should go forward. These things don't vanish. They just get smaller. They get outnumbered by the good ones. Last fall, I went back to the pale yellow cottage. It belongs to the trust now. I've been thinking about what to do with it. Sell it, rent it, keep it. I haven't decided. But I drove out on a Sunday afternoon in October, and I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, and I watched the garden, which Aunt Vera has been tending in the months since we lost Grandma Marta. And I thought about all the conversations that Kitchen had held. The porch door doesn't latch right. I remember that from when I was small. It never latched right. I sat there for a long time. Then I went inside and stood in the kitchen, where the table is still in the same place it has always been, and the bookshelves are still organized the way my grandmother organized them, and the air still smells faintly like cardamom and old paperbacks. On the windowsill, I found something I had missed on earlier visits. A small envelope. My name on the front in her handwriting. Gerald told me later she had left it there deliberately, knowing I would be the one looking through the cottage carefully enough to find it. She knew I would look in the places others wouldn't think to check. Inside, a single index card. Her handwriting, smaller than usual, like she was conserving something. It said, "The door was always yours, Celine." I just made sure they knew where to knock. I stood at that kitchen window for a long time. The garden was going gold. The afternoon was quiet. The door to the porch swung gently open in the wind, the way it always has, unlatched, unheld. I let it. I am not a woman who was saved by an inheritance. I am a woman who was loved by someone who understood that love, real love, plans ahead, that it anticipates the worst and prepares for it quietly and without drama, and leaves you the tools you need before you know you need them. My grandmother could not stop my parents from being afraid. She could not stop my father from choosing control over connection. She could not attend my wedding, and also undo the fact that my parents didn't. She could not give me back the 3 years of missed holidays and unreturned calls, and the particular silence of being cut from a family like a thread, snipped cleanly from cloth. But she could make sure I had ground to stand on. She could make sure that ground was solid and documented, and mine. And she could make sure that the people who loved me by condition, eventually, had to reckon with the fact that unconditional was always available. It was just waiting on the other side of a door they had chosen not to walk through. They're walking through it now, slowly, imperfectly, in the ordinary way of real things. That is enough. That is more than enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who loved you ahead of the storm, tell me in the comments. Tell me who they were. Tell me what they left you. Not the objects. The real thing they left you. I read every comment, and I'll be here. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you for the next one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story, send it to them. Sometimes the most important thing is just knowing someone planned for you. That's everything. Until next time.